With punishments piling up for Russia over the atrocities they're committing in Ukraine, including today their suspension from the UN Human Rights Council, the Boston Athletic Association is adding to the list as well, banning any athletes from Russia and Belarus who currently live there from running this year's marathon. And anyone from those countries who doesn't live there, they can run, but not under those nations' flags. BAA President CEO Tom Grilk said in a statement, "Running is a global sport, and as such, we must do what we can to show our support to the people of Ukraine." Joining me now is sports journalist Shira Springer, journalist and lecturer at MIT Sloan and Boston University, and Dan Fitzgerald, head coach and co-founder of Heartbreak Hill Running Society. Thanks for joining me. Shira, I want to start with you first and just ask what your take is on the BAA's decision.
Well, I think what they're doing is, as Grilk said, showing support for Ukraine. It is primarily, I would say, a symbolic gesture, because if you look at the numbers last year, I think it was around 35 Russians who competed in the Boston Marathon. So we're not talking about large numbers. We're also not talking about any professional or elite athletes. There are no Russian athletes from will be competing in either the marathon, the 5K, or the invitational mile. So largely a symbolic gesture, but I think an important symbolic gesture, particularly given Putin's desire to use sports as a way of showcasing and showing national might. And, he really enjoys putting his athletes, those Russian athletes, out there to show the power and might of his country. So an important symbolic gesture, but a symbolic gesture mostly nonetheless.
And Dan Fitzgerald, your take?
Yeah, I agree. It is mostly symbolic, but I think about it from an athlete's perspective. It's unfortunate when an athlete trains and doesn't get to compete, when the circumstances are outside of their control. On the other hand, the scale of the atrocities is astounding, unimaginable, and anything that can make any difference in people's awareness of what's happening, through any community, I think is important. I think sport in particular these days is feeling more responsibility to step up and speak out in these things. And, I'm proud of the BAA doing that. The race, running the Boston Marathon is a privilege. And it's a symbol of unity. It's a symbol of healing. It's been subject of a terrorist attack. For it to stand on the side of human rights, I think is important.
So the challenge of these sorts of actions, especially when we're right off of the Winter Olympics, where there was much protest and concern about the human rights violations in China and the embrace of the world of China during the Olympics and whether or not it should have been held there or not, we come to this now. And there are 5 countries that top the worst countries for human rights and rule of law in 2021. Egypt, Syria, Yemen, China, and Iran. None of those athletes are banned from participating in the BAA. Should they be? Is this a route, a path that we want to start taking when it comes to events like this, Shira?
Well, I think I'm going to refer back to what Dan said about, you feel for the athletes. I myself am also a marathoner, so I understand what it's like to put in those miles and train for an event like this, something you have on your calendar basically a year in advance when you are thinking about running a big major marathon like Boston. And so I think you don't want to go down that slippery slope with those other countries. We are in a very, very unique moment with Ukraine and the war, between Russia and Ukraine, and also the aggression of Putin and his love of sports and his use of sports as a symbol for his country and what it can accomplish. So I think we should not do a blanket ban of athletes. We should take this on a case-by-case basis. This is the moment to show support for Ukraine. Yes, there are other issues, human rights issues with all of the countries you mentioned. This perpetually comes up in sports, by the way. We're going to face it again with the World Cup later this year in Qatar. So, those are issues we have to deal, I think, with on a case-by-case basis rather than say, oh, well, if we're doing Russia, then we need to do Iran, and we need to do this country, and we need to do that country.
But I would push back here and say, I mean, no one is disagreeing that what's happening in Ukraine is beyond awful. But someone might say what's been happening in China for decades is also awful, or someone might say what's the war in Syria and the trauma that they've been going through, Yemen and America's treatment. I mean, there's where's the line? Is it just because it's happening now and there's a fear of Russia expanding their aggressions? Or is it just the public opinion and sentiment seems to be, as it should be, supporting Ukraine?
Well, we're 2 weeks, almost, we're less than 2 weeks, right, out from the marathon at this point. So I think, first of all, the practicality of doing other bans and sort of more of a larger blanket ban is simply, it's an impractical step, one. This, I think, is a discussion, quite frankly, that the international sports community has to have at another point in time. I can certainly see and think they should have this discussion. How do we, as a sports community, as a global sports community, across not just the running community, but all sports community, and include the International Olympic Committee in this, and FIFA, which, again, with the World Cup, how do we figure out what our policy is? And quite frankly, it probably should be something along the line of a policy for when you have countries who are committing human rights violations. How does that impact athletes? And does it impact the average everyday athlete? That's who we're really talking about here, right? We're not talking about professional athletes. So in this case with the Boston Marathon. So I think there are some questions you need to answer. Does it impact the average everyday athlete? Do we start putting bans on professional athletes? I can see in the future the potential for bans on professional athletes, the bans on countries from competing. I mean, if you recall, during apartheid South Africa was not allowed to compete in the Olympic Games. So I think there is precedent there, and that may be, in some instances, where things may go.
So, Dan, of course, the challenge here, obviously, the athletes, both professional and the amateur, it's heartbreaking when they get caught up in this politics and can't compete. I think we've all expressed that. And at the same time, as someone who loves watching sports and loves watching, the Olympics when countries come together. I mean, I vividly recall when the Koreas North Korea and South Korea walked in together at the Olympic Games years ago, and the ability that sports have to unify us. It sometimes seems to me like this maybe doesn't help us to see each other as humans and the joy of competing against each other.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Sports do unite. I think there is there are lines. You listed 5 countries with highly questionable human rights stances in the immediate term, but there have been, you could make that list very long if we open the scope of what human rights abuses are, and we shouldn't look beyond ourselves to start and things that we've been involved in. So I think it's something that in this scale, a line of this kind of direct aggression and a war that's completely asymmetrical in terms of the two sides and their capacities, and it's completely out of nowhere. It's just an act of aggression and atrocity that I think crosses a line. So yes, sports are unifying. Yes, we love seeing all of the nations compete in the Olympics and the marathon majors. And again, like I said earlier, I just think it's a privilege to be a part of that. And there need to be lines, and not to absolve everybody of all of the atrocities through history, but there also needs to be, I think, a willingness to forgive and move on as well when that happens, sort of the same thing with sanctions and removal of sanctions. I think as it applies to the economy, it can apply to sport. So in the current moment, I absolutely think it's the right thing to do.
Shira, I'm struck by the memories of the terrorist attack, the Boston Marathon bombing, and I just recall vividly children from Syria sending messages to Boston over whatever the social media was at the time, they themselves going through this terrible, civil war in Syria, yet reaching out, and the end of the world of the New York Yankees fans singing "Sweet Caroline," which really brought home the unity and putting things aside. It's certainly not as serious as other things, but it always stayed with me. It seems that sensitivity also informed this decision to do that, to be unified and show support for Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this desire to show up as one running community. I think Dan can speak to this as well, but I know as a runner, it is a very close-knit, very passionate community. And community is the operative word. It is, if you're on social media, if you're even running along the Boston Marathon course on any given weekend during the winter, there is a sense of community and unity. And I think it was all done in that spirit. And again, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, this is more of a symbolic gesture at this point. It is to show support. And then the other 5 countries and the human rights violation, there are political statements and sanctions, perhaps in the among international athletic federations that can come down the line and maybe need to be reevaluated. But I think the context of this is more as symbolic gesture. Ukraine, we have your back. And I think it was also clear in the way in which they structured the policy as well, right? So Ukrainians who were entered and can't compete, they will either get a full refund or they will be able to defer to next year. I know it seems like a small thing, but that's important. This is all designed to be supportive of Ukrainian runners, and to say, listen, we oppose what Russia is doing, but unfortunately, it is the amateur runners who are going to pay the price.
Dan, I've seen Shira running like a maniac at a red light, staying warm before she crossed in front of my car, and I know a lot of people who I don't necessarily like Shira. I do like, and I do like you, Dan, but when they talk about running, they talk about how helpful they are to other people, and I always think, wow, you should really bring that into your personal life as a runner. But the community of runners is a real thing, right? And we shouldn't just kind of gloss over that this is a gesture, but a meaningful one.
It is, absolutely. I mean, I've actually sat with, as I'm just recalling as we're doing this interview, I sat with a running coach from Moscow for lunch at a international coach training session. And, I think when I just think about being a person and running around on the marathon course right now, when I see the Ukrainian flags, they give me hope. It's an important symbol to see in the world right now. And I think it's one that the running community, it's just a community of people who enjoy these international races, who feel the same things that a lot of people are feeling. And, I do also feel a empathy for my Russian friends who are here, who have nothing to do with anything, who feel the pain of what's going on also, and also feel some blowback and maybe some, not responsibility isn't quite the right word, but a conflict and a unhappiness as well.
There's definitely a humanity of everyone who is united. Shira Springer and Dan Fitzgerald, I thank you both for joining me, and I wish you well on your travels of running, and I won't run into you, Shira. Thanks so much for joining me.